So, love always wins is an absolute statement, which always arouses skepticism, even in me. And skepticism usually, not always, but usually will lead to some sort of curiosity. So the fact that you're here means that you're slightly curious anyway, and that's, for me, a good sign of health, to have some curiosity. It's a good sign, builds resilience. I'll talk about that later. And then the other thing I want to do is a disclaimer. I think that the words that I use, and in fact the words that we all use, is comparable to the foam that floats on the top of the ocean. The ocean which is deep and wordless and full of life. And that's my metaphor for this evening, is I'm going to be throwing some foam at you. And I hope you get excited enough to dive in and swim into the depths of the ocean. I'm going to start by talking about my history a little bit, about where this book came from. And I like to start things at the beginning. This is me when I was about 4 months old in 1944, which was right before the end of World War II. And I have seen many pictures like this of many children about this age. They all tend to have this aha kind of look on their face, you know, that life is wonderful. Well, unfortunately, the family that I was born into wasn't that wonderful. And let's just put it briefly, there was a lot of family violence and abuse. My father was quite rigid, authoritarian, and physically abusive, and my mother was pretty much a martyr and suffering like, woe is me, you children are driving me crazy. My sister will remember that. And so I'm going to fast forward to when all of this abuse kind of came to a head, and I had been through a lot already, and in the early 70s, this is how I felt. And I was writing in my journal, and I was wondering, what the hell is wrong with me? Why do I keep doing the same dumb, over and over again? And it's been a long journey figuring that out and unraveling that. And basically I went through 22 years of being chemically dependent on alcohol and other drugs. Mostly marijuana, but mixing it up with other things. And I went through treatment in 1985. Is that coming out? Yeah, okay. And after I went through treatment, and I was out of treatment for several years, they asked me to come back and tell the story of my recovery to the new patients, so that they had some kind of idea of what might lay ahead for them and their path in recovery. And because I tend to think visually, I eventually developed this graph, and every time I'd go and talk to them, I'd draw it on the whiteboard. And I know some of you are squinting and trying to read the text there, but that's not so important as to notice that off of the baseline of continually getting worse and worse and dipping down into negative emotions, there are all these spikes, some of them down, some of them up. And as time progressed, there's a general trend for the spikes to get more and more extreme. And this is where I did the classic hit bottom, where I was suicidal, and it was a choice of either, am I going to give up my drugs and alcohol and figure out some other way to live, or am I just going to continue until I finally just either kill myself with the drugs or some other means. When I went through treatment, it was like jumping off a cliff. I had no idea what I was getting into. It was very frightening. And yet, there was a tremendous amount of support there, and I was able to really take off into my recovery. I was pretty serious about it, and I didn't relapse. And thank God, pray to God, I will not relapse. Telling my story over and over again helped me strengthen my recovery. And being able to see this graphically also strengthens my recovery. But it wasn't until about 2 years into recovery that I did what I call a real surrender and accept that I was really going to recover. I was really going to work at this. I wasn't just going to play at doing this. Because up until that point of surrender, I had a secret plan that when I turned 92, I was going to get loaded and go out in a blaze of glory. Well, it took me a while to figure out that that was not really the way I wanted to die. That I wanted to die clean and sober. But it took me a while to get there. Since that point, my life has just gotten better and better. And it stops here at age 58, which was when I drew this particular graph. I'm now 68, but believe me, this line is keeping going up in a nice, steady rate. And, I'm going to go on to the next graph, because what's important to me is the overall shape of the graph. When I was later in recovery, I read this book in 2004 by Ray and Anderson called The Cultural Creatives. And in the back, there was this, or towards the end, there was this chart of how transformation takes place in any organic system. And Ervin Laszlo claims that any organic system tries to maintain equilibrium. And as they encounter life problems, so to speak, or an environmental problem, they tend to overcorrect in trying to solve the problem. And those overcorrections get more and more extreme until finally the whole system crashes into a place where they cannot solve the problem with the existing tools and operating rules or operating systems that they have in place. And at that point, the organic system can either die, make a new attempt that doesn't get very far, or they can actually jump to a new level of stability. And the people who wrote this book, the cultural creatives, were creating the thesis that this is where, or this is the kind of transition that humanity is going through. And the cultural creatives are the group of people who are no longer struggling, but they're over here somewhere on this chart, and they have a vision of where this stable new level could be. And they're going for it. And they're not back here fighting the old system. They're just out here creating the new system. And that's why they're called the cultural creatives. So I saw the similarity between that chart and my own chart, and it seemed, and I said to myself, well, gee, that seems to make a whole lot of sense. Then I went through a hospice training, and Neela Campbell was a grief counselor who drew this. And in the hospice training, they talked about this whole process of what to expect when somebody gets into grief due to a loss. And there's a lot of, first of all, shock, numb denial, then a lot of confusion, anger, relief, everything going up and down, emotions up and down. And then there's this long, slow slide into a profound sadness. And at that point, the emotions can loop back and go through this all over again, or go down into a clinical depression, or there'll be a process of letting go. And that really made an impact on me, the importance of letting go. When I was in hospice, I visited 2 different men with cancer that were in hospice. And one of them died angry and tied down to a bed in a home, a care center. The other one died at home blissfully. The main difference between them was the one who died blissfully had the attitude of one day at a time. And he had accepted his own mortality, and he was letting go. He was ready. So yeah, there's Ervin Laszlo's process of a whole organic system. There's my process that looks similar of addiction and recovery. And then there's the grief process. So as I got involved in peace building in 2004, and after that, I started to visualize and think about the evolution of a culture of peace. And by working for the U.S. Department of Peace campaign, things started to fit together. That if we had a U.S. Department of Peace that was educating people about how to take care of themselves and each other and society as a whole, we could make this jump. And the Department of Peace was a very holistic, systemic approach, because it wasn't about just creating international peace, it was about creating domestic peace in homes, in schools, in the streets, in prisons, in gangs, through education and support systems, and putting them in place for a lot less cost than all the justice systems and all the war systems and all of those other crisis management systems. So actually, in the process of writing my book, I started to put these little labels on here that we could move out of blame and arrogance, isolation, anger and depression, and analysis paralysis, and let go and move into curiosity, detachment, resilience, self-observation, humility, empathy, vision, service, and authentic relations. And this all defines what I consider to be a culture of peace. So in August of 2006, somebody at the Church of Brethren knew me and invited me to come and give a little sermon there one Sunday. And I got all excited and started writing. And I had already started a blog online about a culture of peace. And I got some pretty good feedback from that sermon at the Church of the Brethren. And then I did another sermon at my own church, the Congregational Church, where we had the Peace Choir sing, and then I would say a few paragraphs, and then they would sing another song, and then I would say another few paragraphs, and it was just really terrific. So I got all this encouragement, and I kept on writing stuff in my blog, and eventually I distilled it as recovery from violence dependency, because I began to draw the parallels between violence as an addiction and drugs as an addiction. And I began to see that violence actually alters brain chemistry in many of the same ways that drugs will do. It's just a different kind of drug. It's adrenaline and probably a few other things mixed in. And we can easily get addicted to it, to recreating that state, because it's an easy out to pump adrenaline into your bloodstream and go into a state of emergency, fight and flight, instead of trying to correct or prevent the crisis that is in place. Instead of trying to heal it, resist it, fight it, run away from it. How I actually got to write the book was the first book I wrote back in 1976 was this book, The Stripper's Guide to Canoe Building. And this came out of my own experience of building canoes for customers. I had just first built a canoe for myself, but because it was wood and it was clear finish and everybody thought it was beautiful, they would say, "Gee, would you build me one? Or can I get a kit from you?" And there were no kits, and there were no instructions on the market, so I filled the niche. And I earned far more money over the 35 years that this was in print than I ever did from building the books themselves. So it made a lot of sense to write a book. And this book got a lot of praise. It comes with a full set of full-size drawings for people who build the canoes. And of course, you can't buy this now. I have a little box at home for my grandchildren. I had all this stuff on a blog, and I've been continually frustrated with the resistance that I always run into when talking about peace being inevitable. Because I really sincerely believe it is. It's just a matter of time. And I could just take those blog materials and edit them into a book. And so I did, and added some material. My own history was in the back. I was trying to hide it. And I circulated about 20 copies to people who read it and critiqued it and gave me feedback. And I gave up because I was devastated for about 2 weeks. And then I said, as I was out walking my dog, I said, oh, I can rearrange things and I can clarify this and I can do this. And so that's when I sat down and wrote the book that's here today, but it also went through criticism and revision. So I actually have some of my editors here tonight, Barbara and Gary, and I'm very grateful for their help in getting this book into a shape where it's readable, understandable, and clear. And so I'm going to read from it. I think that's the next thing, and then it only takes about 8 minutes. I'm going to read about listening. The listener and the speaker are faced with the exact same question. How much do I want to be really seen and known as I truly am? The speaker is just telling their story, but the listener becomes just as visibly known by how well they listen, accept, and respect the story of another without comment, interpretation, or expansion. Listening, not just hearing, real listening, is an act of love. When I am speaking, an individual or group of people, like you, is listening to me with their full attention, not interrupting, and making eye contact with me, I can feel the acceptance. I can feel the love. I can trust that I am okay, just the way I am. It's very difficult to perpetuate my distrust of others when I'm constantly exposed to this kind of listening week after week in my 12-step recovery program. And yet I have found myself threatened by it. Some of us grew up, like me, with so many conditions laid upon us that we do not know how to respond to a lack of conditions. We may feel disoriented and lost, and we truly are lost. We have lost our true selves. In spite of our desperately wanting to no longer live in the hell of solitary confinement, when the jail cell opens, we duck for cover. We stop telling the truth about ourselves. We want to be loved unconditionally, to be trusted. We want to be truly safe, to be okay with not having the answers. At least I do. To be okay with not having the answers, and when this precious jewel of mutual trust and respect begins to appear, we are often too frightened to tell ourselves what it is we really need to hear. And this is a quote by Parker J. Palmer. The soul is like a wild animal, tough, resilient, savvy, self-sufficient, yet exceedingly shy. To see a wild animal, the last thing we should do is crash through the woods, shouting for the creature to come out. But if we walk quietly into the woods and sit silently for an hour or two at the foot of a tree, the creature may well emerge. And out of the corner of an eye, we will glimpse the precious wildness we seek. Therefore, it is important as a listener to allow speakers the time and space to find themselves in their speaking, to not help them out of their cocoon, to let them develop their own conclusions, lessons, and meanings to their own life story. We cannot force someone else to be honest or to say more than they want to say. We cannot make them accept our analysis and interpretation of their situation. We cannot solve their problems or reveal what they should do next in their life. As a listener, we need to just drive the car that we are in, and not someone else's. Or analyzing another person could be a way of avoiding being seen, of hiding, of keeping the focus away from what we fear, the emptiness within us that seems so real, but it isn't. This kind of listening is done with humility. Humility is the awareness that regardless of what role or title we have borne in human society, we are but a speck of sand on the beach of the universe. We are all equal to all the other grains of sand, yet we still have a unique role in the unfolding of the universe. When we respect another's privacy, their sense of living within their own skin, their boundaries and limits that protect them from being used, controlled, or invaded by another person, that respect develops trust between us. That trust encourages openness. Deep within a person who speaks openly, we begin to see our essential selves, and we hear the echo of our own story within their story. Our work in the cultural recovery from violence dependency is on ourselves. It takes more courage and strength of character to trust our angry and grieved companions on this journey, to stay in communication, than it does to imagine that we have the answer. We cannot claim to have the answer because we don't know what it really is. All we have is a crude map. And there are many paths that all lead to the same place. Listening to others is a form of service to them. As we develop skill in that service, we begin to also develop the ability to listen to our own deepest internal self-talk. We develop a compassionate witness, a self-empathy, and a self-respect. We see a similarity between the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we are hearing. The irony of our mutual foolishness begins to emerge in bursts of laughter and sometimes in bursts of tears. This is what I see happening in 12-step recovery meetings. Eventually, as shared insights become the things that we treasure, we discover something unexpected and unpredictable will arise, especially if more than two people are present. In small groups that are gathered in circles expressing the equality of all those present, a wisdom beyond the capacity of any one person will bubble to the surface, literally pop out of someone's mouth without any forethought. This has been known in indigenous cultures since the dawn of humanity and lost in the industrialized culture. When given the space to be there, a collective wisdom, a creative solution to a vexing problem appears spontaneously out of seemingly nowhere. There are currently many cutting-edge practitioners developing ways to apply this phenomenon not only to personal development, but also to organizational development in business and politics. To summarize, I suggest that listening is the primary activity for building a culture of peace within a person, a family, a neighborhood, a nation, or the entire planet. If we practice deep listening, we begin to live according to these 4 principles. 1, we release all expectations. The less fixed our ideas about what peace is supposed to look like, or how to get there, or how soon, the more able we will be to recognize resources as they arise. This is a multi-year experiment, this culture of peace. 1 step at a time, and may require restarting the process several times. 2, we regard everyone as a resource because everyone in our life is a stakeholder. And no matter their level of involvement, they each have a unique contribution to make. Peace is about inclusiveness. 3, we focus on the process, not the result. In order to empower ourselves to take action, we need to create connection that is heart-to-heart, face-to-face, and to allow an abundance of time and space for conversation to occur. We encourage listening and empathy skills. We build the common story of what's valued. 4, we see ourselves as part of a movement that focuses on strengthening positive assets. We're not on a campaign to force specific things to happen, specific changes to happen. We avoid fixed positions, declarations, becoming institutionalized or issue-focused. This is about maintaining a conversation, a vision, and hope of what is possible, not about policies or politics. So that is called living from the listener. In other words, being the listener. Do you have any questions, comments? Let's talk.
What were some of your major influences for got you into this, or listening?
Can you repeat the question?
She wants to know what influenced my journey, I think is the question.
Teachers.
Teachers. The person who wrote the foreword in the book has been one of my most recent strong influences. Her name is Dot Maver. She's the president of the National Peace Academy, and I've attended an intensive peace builder, peace learning training with her in Ohio that was quite transformative. And she also was the executive director of the campaign for U.S. Department of Peace. And I met her in Portland once when she came out for a trip. And I just immediately connected. It was like we were on the same path. We're brother and sister. Let's go. Other big influences have been, in my college years, Bucky Fuller. And I got a degree my master's degree was in systematic design planning. And it was taught by someone who was, I guess, an associate of Bucky Fuller. And so it was very theoretical. But it really has helped me the rest of my life learn how to solve problems by, breaking them down into all their pieces and then letting them digest for a while. Another major influence was Oscar Ichazo, who was the teacher of this school called the Eureka School. I got into it in the 70s and was in it for about 15 years. It was a multi-level kind of school, and it was a mystical school. And I learned, and it was very eclectic, and I learned all kinds of stuff and had all kinds of wild experiences. But that really deepened my own mysticism and sense that I'm not just a physical body, and there's more to life than what's apparent physically. Okay, well, the last question first. Yes, there have been activists who have been to Obama rallies and have gotten up to the ropes and the Secret Service people and handed him a pamphlet and a book about the U.S. Department of Peace. And he said, I'll read it. Whether he did or didn't, we don't know. Dennis Kucinich just lost his seat in Congress, so he can no longer actively promote it after this session. And we don't know whether he's going to move to some other state or what he's going to do next. He's not saying. And I'm not involved anymore in that campaign. I'm doing the Eugene City of Peace campaign, which is, for me, a building block for building a national Department of Peace. That it became apparent to me after working on the national campaign and going to Congress and knocking on doors and speaking to legislative aides after a couple of years, that Congress is really broken. It's not very responsive. They're very polite, but they're not very responsive. And it was going to be a long haul, and I was getting frustrated, and I began to just see that working locally, I had a better chance of creating more leverage among the political base, the voters, if I could meet with them face to face. I don't know, I just learned a lot about political campaigning by doing that. And the campaign itself, there is still a Peace Alliance organization, and some of the same people are in it and running it, and they still have a website, and they've started finally to branch out and build collaborations. Like this summer, they're helping the Shift Network, which is based in San Francisco, do the Summer of Peace campaign, and which is a collaboration with Push for Peace and a whole bunch of other organizations, building up to the International Day of Peace this September. And they have other pieces of legislation that they're promoting as well. There's a Youth Promise Act that they've been working on for a couple of years, which would be specifically just part of the Department of Peace to reduce youth gang violence. And it's using like best practices and things like that. So it's very practical. But my dream is to create a broad awareness just within, what do we have here, 150,000 people of Eugene, that we are already well on our way towards a culture of peace. And that everyone who builds something to help the quality of life here, the quality of the environment, the quality of the economics, is helping to build a culture of peace here. And so I'm building a map. You really got me talking now. I'm building an interactive online map where people can actually see this visually. It'll be like a family tree. And we're going to launch it on the International Day of Peace. And I'm working to bring Marilyn King here, who is an Olympic athlete, who has developed a program to train at-risk youth that are middle school and high school to think about how they think, so that they start to think like an Olympic champion and visualize their goals and create a plan for getting there and create coaches and mentoring to support them on the way. And they graduate from high school, go to college, and become community leaders. Now that may seem like a far fetch from creating global peace, but Marilyn King's passion is to create global peace, and she and I also believe that that population of young people is the keystone population. And if you can get that group of people to suddenly achieve extraordinary things, you can move the whole population. That's what I'm excited about now and what I'm working on. In fact, Jim Anderson back there, associated with Beyond War, he and I are going up to the Rotary Conference next weekend, no, the 23rd, just a week and a few days from now. Rotary has started to get on the bandwagon of global peace. And they're having a conference in Portland called Peace is Possible, One Community at a Time. And so I'm going up there with a table, and I'm going to tell them about Eugene. And we'll see if we can get started. Yeah, Randy.
I'm curious about how these things worked out and applied to very specific problems of violence now. I mean, because to a lot of people, I think it sounds kind of abstract, especially Eugene is relatively peaceful, but there are places where prevention strategies, you know, in Boston, there was a lot of murders among youth.
Yeah.
They actually say that now in Chicago, where like 8 people were killed in 40 in 1 weekend, that it's actually better than it was.
Yeah.
In Los Angeles, people like the Catholic Church worked in one part and reduced it. Other parts, things weren't so successful.
Yeah.
Do you think that these strategies are working? Is that what it is? The kind of peacemaking that you're familiar with?
I would say that the strategies are slowly being adopted, but they're not broad enough spread out yet. But there's been a lot of testing going on, and there's institutions like the Washington Public Policy Institute, something. They have collected enormous amounts of data about what works and what doesn't, and the cost to benefit ratios. It's a tremendous resource. And they have all these kind of statistics. One of the most alarming things, and this is related to the media and how much we know about the violence that's going on and how much we don't know, is that on average there are 16 youth killed every day violently. And we only hear about the most dramatic, traumatic incidences. But there's gun violence, knife violence, fights, and everything going on all the time. And, I don't think anybody really knows exactly where we stand, but we do know that the amount of education that people are getting about conflict resolution skills and other peace-building skills, that kind of education has literally gone exponential. And back in the 90s, you could not find a college program on peace building or conflict resolution. And now there are over 400 degrees offered at universities and colleges in that kind of work. In fact, our own University of Oregon has a graduate program in conflict resolution. So it's hopeful.
What about like elementary school?
I understand, Valerie, you might be able to answer this better than I, but from my understanding, in the public schools, it's very hit and miss, depending on the district, the voters, the superintendents, the personnel, and the funding.
I mean, is it part of your vision?
Oh, yeah.
To
You can't start early enough.
I mean, in a more deliberate way that you would put forth your organization or what have you, would put forth like a curriculum for.
Are you talking about the Olympic Thinking Initiative? Because I don't
just
myself.
Something like for children, like about violence, like to get them to relate more peacefully to each other.
They learn a lot from their parents, and so I strongly believe in parenting education, starting in high school, before people are sexually active. Is give them parenting education.
Elementary school.
Yeah. Ruth?
It makes me wonder about the role of video games and kids that are not engaged in relating to each other, but more from technology.
There's been a lot of criticism of the violence in our media, generally, in our movies, our television, and the video games. We spend, $10 billion a year on video games? I'm just trying to pull this out of the top of my head, but it's an enormous amount of money. And there's this retired colonel who has a website called Killology, and he used to train soldiers how to kill, how to be quick in their decision making and accurate with their guns so that the level of killing would go up for the Army and the other military branches. Well, he had a shift. And now he sees that what's necessary for people to kill other people is that they become desensitized. And so that they see other human beings as objects and not as humans. And that we do that through our media, constantly, with no controls. In the military, at least they have controls over the servicemen. But the general public, there's no controls. And so it's understandable that we have outbreaks of...
The president praising gunning down the bad guy as he's surrendering.
And I know. There's some
Osama,
There's some pretty sick things.
That's pretty bad.
Doug, did you have a question?
Not yet.
Oh, I thought I saw you wave your hand. Yeah.
Well, all the talk about the military makes me think that about how much money is made off of the war and how they're actually started so that somebody is making money.
Right.
There are billions and billions of dollars that's been that way throughout history, I'm sure. So what are we going to do about that?
It's it's a very complex, very enormous problem, and my thesis is that we can disassemble that whole logjam one log at a time. Don't try dynamite, just one log at a time. And that the economics of the military has to be redirected, is what it has to be, so that the people who are making the guns and the fighters and the battleships are retooled to make things like wind generators and desalination plants and things that are more helpful. But to get to that point, there are other things that have to happen before that, and then other things that have to happen before that. And one of the things I did in my book was do this thing called backcasting. What has to happen before the end goal, and then keep working back and keep working back. And one of the first things that has to happen, in my opinion, is a broad coalition, collaboration. And that doesn't, and someone really helped me see that collaboration is much stronger and deeper than cooperation. Cooperation is when we work together when it's convenient at certain points, but we're not always working together. And collaboration means we give up our own position in order to be of service to the whole. And then we really are in collaboration. We're working together as a unit. And that's one of the big things that needs to happen. And early on, I kept pushing the Peace Alliance to collaborate with Beyond War, collaborate with, all these other organizations. There's so many of them that are now existing, but they do what people have called silos, where they take a special interest and they have a grant that funds them, and they want to protect their territory, and they're not really willing to let go of that. So that's one of the big first steps. And I think we're getting there. It's kind of like pulling teeth. We're getting there.